Welcome to New Horizons in Chinese Philosophy. This is Lecture 13. In this lecture and next, we will discuss legalism. Legalism is the last school of thought we address in this course. As we see from the discussion of Xunzi, legalism is subtly involved with other schools of thought. So, before we go into the details of legalism, we need to say something about how legalism came into existence. Let's talk about the question of evolution of legalism. There is a sharply drawn dichotomy in Confucian outlook between a society based primarily on the spiritual moral cement of Li and a society based primarily on sanctions of force. Li is conceived of as a body of prescriptions ideally based on non-coercive bonds. It is conceived of as finding its ultimate source in moral impulses of living individuals. In a truly good society, the need for penal sanctions and external compulsion is not to be thoroughly eliminated, although it is to be minimized. However, this dichotomy is not so conspicuous in pre-Confucian classics. In the Book of Documents, passages attributed to King Wu and even to the Duke of Zhou indicate that the use of force in a righteous cause is by no means deprecated. In the announcement to Kang, the young Prince Kang has been charged with founding the Principality of Wei. He is admonished to adhere to the penal code of the Shang dynasty to punish all manner of crime and all forms of official misconducts. He is admonished to adhere to the provisions of the penal code and not to follow his own inclinations. He is admonished to use the full severity of law against the unfilial and unfraternal. In this way, penal sanctions are introduced into the very heart of the familial network in which the bonds of family morality should be predominant. From this, we can see that the early Zhou rulers were not reluctant to support the holy rites with heavy penal sanctions. The virtue of the rulers was manifested as much in their righteous punishments as in the power of their moral influence. In the history of the spring and autumn period, there are many tendencies leading in the proto-legalist direction. Many pre-Confucian statesmen seem quite prepared to accept what seemed to them to be the imperative demands of the times. As active state officials, they direct their attention to the problem of the survival or ascendancy of the states which they serve. As is mentioned in the previous lecture, the famous Guanzhong, as a minister of Qi, was prepared to use the sanction of force in international affairs. He was also credited with a series of proto-legalist reforms within the borders of Qi itself. In fact, he is treated in the later literature as a forefather of legalism. Another figure we want to mention is Zi Chan. Zi Chan is an older contemporary of Confucius. He is one of the wisest men of his time. He is a leading statesman in the small ancient state of Zheng. At that time, the state of Zheng was under threat of extinction by its powerful neighbors Chu and Qin. Zi Chan is said to be a man who exemplifies the virtuous practice of Li in his personal life. As such, he was admired by Confucius. However, as an active statesman, he is deeply committed to the survival of Zheng. He does not seem to believe that the sincere practice of Li alone can secure the survival of his state. Within the boundaries of his state, the bonds of Li had not prevented murderous and anarchic conflicts among the members of the dominant lineages and local nobility. Anarchy was evidently prevalent among the people. The people's productivity had been disrupted by chaotic agrarian situation. Zi Chan put forward a reform program. The overall aim of the reform is to strengthen the authority and power of the ruler against all the centrifugal forces. The hereditary nobles would, in his program, continue to act as functionaries, but they would be chosen on the basis of merit. They were to adhere strictly to the rules governing their offices and ranks. The people were to be organized into mutually responsible groups. The penal laws were to be made public by being inscribed on bronze tripods. This makes sure law and order on the grassroots level by a reliance on strict penal law. By such measures, the state of Zheng might be able to survive as an entity, although it remains to be a satellite of the neighboring great power of Qin. Shu Xiang is the statesman of the state of Qin. He objects to Zi Chan's program. So long as the penal law remains in the secret archives of the state, those who administer the code are free to employ their own private judgment and their own moral discretion in applying the codes to the variety of human situations. Shu Xiang says that, quote, "The ancient kings deliberated about the nature of particular circumstances and did not make codes of penal law," end quote. However, since crimes could not be prevented, they did finally create penal codes. But in relating to the people, they basically relied on the power of the Li, on humanity and righteousness. What the people relied on was the virtue of the ruling class. The people could, under proper social conditions, themselves internalize proper ethical attitudes. Nevertheless, Zi Chan's motivation in making public the code seems to be to escape from the vague and arbitrary way of controlling popular behavior. If the people know that certain types of behavior considered unacceptable by the rulers will inevitably lead to certain terrible consequences, the need for the reliance on the unreliable subjective moral judgments of the rulers would have been removed. In the state of Zheng, it is no use relying on the moral judgment of ruling people to maintain the social order. Zichan realizes that in terms of his immediate political goals, the reliance on the potent incentive of fear of the law provided the most reliable method of controlling the behavior of the people. His response to Shu Xiang's rebuke goes like this, quote, "I do not have the necessary talent. I cannot plan for our children and grandchildren. I can only plan to save our present generation." Unquote. Zichan seems to say that ultimate salvation of the world can only be achieved by the restoration of the government based on the virtue of superior men. But in the short run, a strict system of penal laws can be most effective. What Shu Xiang seems to emphasize can be summarized in the following two theses. On the one hand, if the people's behavior is governed wholly by its response to an objective and invariable code of penal law, the reason for existence of a ruling class as an ethical vanguard will be undermined. On the other hand, after the people familiarize themselves with the provisions of the law, they will simply develop ingenuity and resourcefulness in evading the law and finding their way around it. In their efforts to struggle against the oppressive system imposed on them, they will become crafty, cunning, contentious, and defend their own self-interest against an implacable state. In Confucius' words, they will no longer know shame. The first thesis has a lot to do with Confucius' aim of preserving the prerogatives of the hereditary nobility. This stratum claimed to legitimize itself in terms of its supposed ethical function. As Confucius states in the words of the 左传, quote, "The people will study the tripos and will not honor the nobles. What function will the nobles then have to preserve?" Unquote. Confucius identified with a ruling stratum which ideally based its claim to authority on its supposed role as the ethical vanguard of society. He believed in the functionality of such a class. He emphasizes that the leading function of any ruling class was ritual and ethical. He was aware that the ruling class was not performing its class function. The second thesis is the most interesting Confucian argument against legalism. What Shu Xiang and Confucius attack is the behaviorist assumption that negative conditioning based on fear will in fact accomplish its purpose of controlling the people. No matter how passive the people are, they do possess a capacity for a moral life of their own. The obverse side of this moral capacity is the capacity to develop cunning and ingenious ways of resisting efforts to control them by simply fear-inspiring mechanisms. On a deeper level, there is a fundamental issue dividing Confucianism from legalism as a total system. In Confucianism, the agency of living persons, let alone the agency of vanguard elite, plays a dominant role in shaping society. Individual humans may achieve the highest norms of social political order, or they may effectively outwit the norms. In legalism, there is a vision of society in which objective mechanisms of behavioral control become automatic instruments for achieving well-defined social political goals. 资产's program anticipates a major aspect of legalism, its dynamic, goal-oriented nature. It is a sort of instrumental rationalism. It is designed to devise the means appropriate to the achievement of the goal. Lord Shang later defined this goal as follows, quote, "The enrichment of the state and the strengthening of its military capacity," unquote. To 资产, this goal does not represent any imperialism. In his own weak state of Zheng, it represents a strategy of survival. In the period following Confucius' death, the factors favorable to the evolution of legalism does not be so active. The main immediate challenge to Confucianism comes from Mozi and his followers. However, Mohism in some ways prepares the group for a full-blown theory of legalism. As a matter of fact, the Moist account of man in a state of nature bent wholly on pursuing his own self-interest did strongly influence the legalist model of man. There is a common rejection of a morality of inner intentions and of the role of Li between Mohism and legalism. The morality of both Mohism and legalism is utilitarian, although there is a wide divergence in the concept of the ends to be pursued. There is a regard for the role of rewards and punishments as a motivating force throughout the book of Mozi. However, the discussion of rewards and punishments is bound up with a deep emphasis on the moral will of heaven and the spirits who are to be both feared and loved. The ends to be achieved are universal peace and welfare. The strengthening of powerful states is by no means a terminal goal in Mohism. Mozi's ends remains to be universalistic. His attitude toward the conflicts of the states in his time is oriented toward the goal of world peace and prevention of war. His utilitarianism is by no means behavioristic as that of the legalists. His utilitarianism and his rejection of the inner sources of morality do not preclude a space for the role of moral sentiments. In fact, universal love becomes the crucial cement binding the individual interest to the general interest. Legalistic behaviorism, with its indifference to sentiments, may be more logical than Moist utilitarianism. But legalist utilitarianism is not focused on any immediate achievement of the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Its immediate utilitarian goal is the enhancement of state power, which may have no immediate relation to the happiness of the greatest number. In the period following Confucius' death, the center of proto-legalist tendencies shifted to the area of the state of Jin. Like the state of Qi, the state of Jin had been a leader of the hegemonic league of powers. As a result of its many conquests, it had also been a pioneer in establishing direct local bureaucratic control over many regions of its state. It thus participates in the general movement toward bureaucratic rationalization in the Chinese world of the time. However, it is also a state in which the upper layers of government were still dominated by large feudal lineages. After 497, the state was divided into 3 new states by the lineages of Wei, Han, and Zhao. The rulers of the new states were themselves members of hereditary local nobility, but they had managed to found their new states by overthrowing the legitimate Jin prince. This may have weakened their bonds to tradition. The history of their own rise to power made them suspicious of the hereditary subnobility in their own domains. This might account for the enthusiasms of the young Duke Wen of Wei for surrounding himself with members of the wandering Shi. At first, he was deferential to disciples of Confucius, such as Zixia, but soon he became responsive to the proto-legalist advice of ambitious and realistic Shi, such as Li Kui and Wu Qi. They are the forefathers of legalism. It is said that these men were disciples of Zixia and Zhengzi, but as they lived in a world in which Mozi attacked the fatalistic Confucian Ru, they turned their attention to programs which anticipated and influenced the legalist program of Lord Shang. The weakening of the princely relatives and noble clans, the increase of agricultural production by opening up new lands, the reform of military organization, and the stress on codes of penal law all figure largely in the accounts of their programs.